if you will, Pete, let's start and introduce ourselves around the table here and tell them who you are and where you're from.
I'm Pete Warren from Augusta. I'm representing Mosley, South Beach Community Review of Wayne, Lakeville, Keys.
I'm Greg Morris, I'm from Raleigh.
And right on time is
Right on time, thank you, Mr. Chairman. John Burns, I'm from Effingham County, Extremity County, and Jenkins County, and all those good places in Southeast Florida.
and I'm Bob Lane, the chairman. I'm from Statesboro, Georgia.
Cicely Hill, Vice Chair, and I'm from Camden County and a portion of Gwinnett.
And I'm David Knight, I'm from Spalding County, I represent folks in Lamar and Butts also.
And I'd like to introduce some people that we feel as a committee are important to this committee, and I think most of y'all already know them, but for those that that might be joining us from elsewhere, some folks that are, and I don't see Commissioner Holcomb, is he not present yet?
We have a board.
Have a board meeting, and he may be here later, I think he told me. But I'd like to introduce Susan Shipman, who is the Director of the Coastal Resources Division of Natural Resources. I'll hold your introduction to later. Becky Kelly, has she made it, or is she coming that you know of? No.
She's en route, I understand.
Well, Becky is the Director of the State Parks Division, and we went to Parks, Recreation, Historic Sites Division, and we'll welcome her maybe later. Dan Forrester is the Director of the Wildlife Resources Division. Gardner Sapp is our house research person who coordinates these committee meetings and will help us with the technical side of it, and of course keeps our minutes and really handles most of the committee functions as far as anything that's distributed or anything. Also, our legislative council this year is Wayne Allen, who we are not going to take up any legislation today or have any votes today, so they are so busy over there. We gave him today off where he wouldn't have to come and be with us today where he could do some of his other works. Also, our intern for this year is Erica Askew. Erica is in the back here. She'll be helping our committee this year. And those of you that call in, you may get Erica on the phone or either my secretary, Pat Harris. And I think both of them will be glad to help y'all with any requests you might have from the committee. We adopted the rules that we operate under as a committee last session, which is the first year of a 2-year term, and we will continue unless I hear objection from any of the committee members to operate under the same rules. Are there any objections? Okay, we'll operate under the same rules that we adopted last session and continue doing that. Our committee meetings are scheduled to be in this room, the Coverdale Legislative Office Building 506 at 3:30 on Tuesdays. So we welcome any of y'all that would like to come and join us to come and be with us to those committee meetings. Hopefully, and that's a big hope, I guess, is we won't have a lot of legislation this year, but I do plan to have our meetings on a regular basis and take up different topics that are important to this committee and that are important to the state of Georgia and our hunters and our fishermen and our people who visit the state parks from time to time. We have, I think, next Tuesday, we will have Dan Forrester and the Wildlife Resources Division will give us a presentation on law enforcement and the trials and tribulations that they have and the customer services that they do and the way they handle it and what they try to do to make it as pleasant an opportunity for you folks that might encounter his people. So we look forward to that. One of our, possibly the next Tuesday, we may have Becky Kelly and give us an update on what's happening with the state parks. And we'll take up issues like that as we go along and as needs be. If there are other issues that come to the forefront, such as the baiting of deer or issues like that, deer dogging or whatever, we'll some of those things might get waylaid and we might have to take up some of the other issues, or there could be some legislation that comes through that will be time consuming. If we do, we'll have those things also probably would get priority over any of the other presentations we're thinking about doing. Today, is one of those informative meetings. And it's to make this committee aware of what's been going on within the department, within the Coastal Resources Division of the Department of Natural Resources. I wanted the committee, I've had the opportunity to meet with several of these folks that you'll hear from today, and they all present a good particular side of this shrimp fisheries issue. It's all important to them, each one individually, and to a group of people, and we want to hear what they have to say. And but basically, the department has been in charge, or has spearheaded this study to see which direction we need to go as far as the shrimp industry is headed, and what we need to do or don't need to do. And with that, I'm going to introduce Mr. Spud Woodward, who is the Assistant Commissioner for Coastal Resources Division, and Assistant Division Director, excuse me.
Right.
I'll get that
I'm
straight.
not ready to be anywhere near Commissioner yet.
But we'll, Spud, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I think you have a format of how you want to handle it. And,
Yes, sir.
you know, if you need us along the way, holler.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, for taking the time to meet with us today. Before I start my presentation, I'd like to introduce some other staff members from Coastal Resources, as well as the guests that we've invited to come before you today. First, I'd like to introduce Pat Gear. Pat is our Research and Surveys Program Supervisor. Some of you remember Pat from some of our previous discussions on blue crabs. Doug Hammonds is with our Constituent Services Program. Doug provides a lot of the interaction and liaison with the commercial and recreational fishing industry. And our guest we have today, first of all, is Mr. George Dick. He is now retired from the J.W. Fanning Institute. He was the lead facilitator for our public involvement process, and I'm going to be calling on him a little later to provide his perspective on the process that we used. Also in attendance at our invitation are Jimmy Drury from Camden County. We have Tim Jones from Camden County, Pat Matthews from Chatham County, and John Wallace from McIntosh County. And what I'd like to do is just give you a little bit of a context for why we started a public involvement process and looked into shrimp fishery reform, get George to talk about the process itself and the methods that were used, and then invite these gentlemen to give you their own unique individual perspectives about what we did, how we did it, and what the outcomes have been. And I'm going to make reference to this binder of information that you have in front of you. And if you need an extra copy, we've got some down here. Mr. Burns, you need a copy? Sure. Sure, I've got it. I won't have to share it. Most of this binder of information is self-explanatory, but what I want to do is talk a little bit about why we started a process of shrimp fishery regulatory reform, and particularly the public involvement. The condition of the shrimp fishery has changed dramatically since its inception back in the early 20th century. The global economics have obviously changed everything that we deal with on a daily basis, and shrimping has been particularly impacted by that. In that the value of domestic wild-caught shrimp is largely controlled now by the influence of vast quantities of imports. So the economics have changed. As we all know, the price of a gallon of fuel has changed remarkably. So individuals who rely on internal combustion engines to engage in commercial harvest obviously have to deal with that as an increase in operational cost. Also, we're seeing more interest now in tourism in coastal Georgia than we've ever had. We've got a growing population that's record-setting in terms of the number of people that are down there. So there's a lot of things that have made the circumstances in coastal Georgia vastly different now than they were just as recent as the late 1990s, when a joint legislative study committee investigated the shrimp fishery and made some recommendations that were ultimately turned into law. Given the fact that we are dealing with a different situation now, and there has been some outcomes of what happened in the 90s that has sort of developed, the timing was right, and there was some individuals in the General Assembly that wanted us to take a look at it, and we felt like the time was right to take a hard look at it. and we asked for the endorsement of the commissioner to move forward with the public involvement process, which we began in the spring. And we knew that it was going to be important to have an objective party lead this process, and that's why we went to first the Carl Vinson Institute of Government to engage their services, and later, due to a reorganization at the University of Georgia, the responsibility was passed to the J.W. Fanning Institute, but the staff remained the same. So from the beginning to the end, George was the lead facilitator, and it was his staff that was responsible for overseeing that process. If you go to behind tab 2, it sort of walks you through a chronology of the process from the very beginning of how we met with some of our standing citizens advisory groups, had some open public meetings which were facilitated to try to get just every idea and every concept on the table so that that could then be brought forward to the stakeholder panel for them to take a close look at in their deliberations, which took place over the course of the summer into the fall. One of the most critical aspects of any public involvement process, particularly with a stakeholder panel, is populating that panel with the right representatives from the industries or the different sectors that are going to be affected. And that was one of the most difficult tasks we had, was getting people that would commit to the participation that we were going to require. And we were asking a lot of these folks, and days out of their lives, and we had 21 people that committed, ultimately 19 of which were fully involved in the process. So these are 19 people who gave, several days of their life without any compensation, and we owe them a debt of gratitude for persisting through this. And I mean, it was a labor on their part to come there and be there, starting at 9 o'clock in the morning all the way through to 4 or 5 in the afternoon. We did feed them a midday meal. We did at least do that, and we try to feed folks if we can't do something else. But what we did is, over the course of the summer, had several meetings where the stakeholders were given an opportunity to interact with each other and debate and discuss a variety of issues. At the end of that part of the process, we vetted their recommendations, many of which were highly divisive. I mean, there were many things like modified cast nets where there was not agreement. There was nowhere near consensus. On some other topics, there was strong agreement amongst all the sectors, whether they might be a trawler or a recreational fisherman. But there were a lot of divided issues. But what we wanted to do then was take it out in front of the public and just sort of ground truth it to see what the public felt about some of these ideas and recommendations. And we did that in two formats. We did it both through open public meetings where the participants were allowed to use electronic polling, and this is something that George can talk about more in depth if he wants to. And we also had a web-based internet survey. This is something that the department is aspiring to use more frequently because it gives a lot of people who don't have the flexibility to come to a public meeting an opportunity to weigh in on issues. It's another form of opinion poll. So we had those two forms of public input in the autumn, and then transitioned from a stakeholder panel process into a standing citizens advisory group. We rely heavily on public input in all of our decision-making processes in Coastal Resource Division. We have the Coastal Fisheries Advisory Council, which has stood since, when would that be? Since 1974. I mean, we'd like to think that we have been a leader in the department in terms of public input. We've always valued it and always aspired to have it as much as we could. But we needed to transition from the stakeholder panel, basically turn these 19 people loose. We couldn't just keep them engaged in this indefinitely. Have a standing citizens advisory group that would then further deliberate on these recommendations, debate them, see if they could maybe refine them, come to more agreement on some of the divisive issues. And this group met in early December and once again hung up on some of these things like modified cast nets. What we did after that meeting is bring the further refined recommendations back to the Coastal Fishery Advisory Council at their mid-December meeting. And that group decided to reject those recommendations, again, primarily because of the divisiveness of the modified cast nets and some of the aspects related to commercial cast netting. It was a split vote that was ultimately broken by the chairman. It was a 5-5 vote, and it was split by the chair's affirmative vote in support of the motion to reject. The council made no further deliberations. They didn't come back and say, well, we'll look at this later on. It just sort of a summary rejection. So that's all outlined in this chronology here, and there's a variety of supporting information that you can see through the other tabs. But what I'd like to do now is invite Mr. George Dick to come up and sort of give you his perspective on the process. George has worked in the area of facilitation his whole career, and he's brought a very unique perspective to this process, and I wanted him to share it with you. And then after his remarks are concluded, I want to revisit these specific recommendations and talk a little more about those.
Thank you, Spud. Mr. Dick, we appreciate you coming and being with us today and giving us your perspective of how this thing was put together and what you did with partnership.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. Before I start, I'd like to say that my roots are in Spalding County, and I'm glad that you're here. But I've been all over the place. My career expanded from Missouri, Illinois, South Carolina, and Georgia, all in the service of the people of this country because of being in the United States Air Force and then serving in South Carolina and Georgia in regional and community development. The latest thing I was before I became an alpaca farmer was a faculty member at the University of Georgia. And in that position, I worked in the state of Georgia and the surrounding states for approximately 15 years in the latter part of my career. And we profess, some of you have heard the Institute of Community and Area Development, which is an old part of the university when I first started working. The principles of what we did at the coast and what we did throughout is based in reality in the founding of our country. It's based in the area of town hall meetings that move from gathering information until you have a representative group that sorts through that information just as you do and makes decisions and recommendations that are long-term and such as that. Specifically to the coast, when we first met in April of this past year, we had a long talk about what needed to be done as far as dealing with an industry in crisis. That's my term, not the DNR. And because of that, one of the things that we asked and they complied with is that when there was a panel established, that it would be representative of all areas, to have the people who would typically be known as the bomb throwers inside the tent instead of outside the tent. And they complied, and we had a really good group. We began the process by interviewing each one of those individuals so that we'd have a base to share with each other of our opinions. And then we held, as Spud pointed out, the 2 town hall meetings. In that process, we used a nominal grouping process that was designed so that no one person could dominate the meeting, and that every person at the meeting would have an opportunity to give the input that they wanted to the process. That took place, and I believe there were probably close to 200, 300 people that attended those meetings, very well attended. That information was tabulated, and when we met with the committee or the task force the first time, it was presented to the task force. And we began looking at the different sectors of the shrimp fishery in Georgia, trying to determine what were some of the most critical issues that had come out of the public hearings and from the interviews, and how we could approach those things in a way that would provide the most logical and efficient way of dealing with a problem that had been germinating for generations. And so once that was done, we began looking at it and boiling it down. I would say we probably had close to 400 recommendations at one point in time. Those recommendations were looked at. They were first dealt with within the group using what we call an electronic polling process. That was within the group. That got it down to a smaller number, and then we met again and reduced it further, and we had the electronic network that some of y'all probably have dealt with before with the Carl Vinson Institute of Government, where we had terminals at each of the tables, and as we went through the things, people at each table in consensus could put in the changes they'd like to see with each of the recommendations. Once that consensus was come up with, we had another electronic polling and narrowed it further. But before we went to the public with the recommendations, it was my decision that we needed to have a meeting so that we could take the recommendations that came from the public, recommendations that came from the task force that was sitting, and the DNR staff. Because from our viewpoint, the most long-lasting and most beneficial recommendations that could come out would be those that each group could work toward. And we had to know where the Department of Natural Resources stood on some of the issues and where each of the segments of the industry or the fishery stood. Once that had been deliberated, and we did not use electronic polling, we used the manual version of electronic polling where the sticky dots were put on the sheets where you looked at where you think some of the strongest effort should be applied. Again, that boiled the recommendations down to the point where they were tabulated by the Department of Natural Resources and presented to the public in two public meetings. Those public meetings were conducted using the electronic polling process where each individual at the meeting was handed what looked like a garage door opener with numbers from 1 to 0, and they had the opportunity to express their opinion on each of the recommendations. That process went through, and at the same time, after that process, people who were attending at the public hearing were told that they had other comments that they wanted to write in. They welcomed those, and that they could go to the electronic version as well and give their opinion there. It was a process that stressed the total accumulation of information to focus on a problem. Now, the reason I keep saying problem is because the coastal fishery is faced with a situation where there are families involved that have been involved in this fishery for years and generations, and there was a need to apply a solution, or at least a process that would allow those families and people in the industry an opportunity to start looking at how they could make modifications to continue their livelihood. I realize that as a facilitator going in, and even though a facilitator is not supposed to be caught up in the emotions of the thing, you can't help but look at a situation when you have families involved, such as the textile industry in our country, where you really want to make sure that when something comes out, that it really is going to be a long-term thing. Our process was never intended to come up with a specific, definite recommendation as such. It was designed to come up with a set of recommendations that a group could continue working on. And I believe that's the reason they established the group that is now working on the recommendations. Are there any questions?
Any questions from the committee? I have one question, just as you were explaining it, the issues that y'all put the sticky dots on, or that you had electronic voting or whatever, did the members of the stakeholders group or decide what issues you were going to talk about, or was this something that you or DNR or somebody else came up with as issues that needed to be considered?
I'm sorry. At the point in time where we did the sticky dot exercise, there were two things that were presented to the task that was there. There were the recommendations that boiled down through the task group, and there was a recommendation set that was provided by the Department of Natural Resources. Before we used those, however, with the group, we asked the group if it was favorable to them to look at them, and they said it would be more than beneficial to move forward and also look at what DNR said, because they needed to know what DNR thought from the beginning. And as the process went through that day, they added and changed, and some of the things that were offered by both sets were melded together or changed to come up with the final recommendations.
Any other committee members got any questions while we've got him up here concerning the process and how it evolved and what process they went through to reach this conclusions that we got before us here? don't think we got any questions, and we appreciate it.
Thank you, George. We appreciate your willingness to come and be with us today and talk about that from a first-hand standpoint. I'd like to call your attention to the information behind tab 7. This is the list of recommendations that were presented to and refined by the DNR Shrimp Advisory Panel, and you have in your booklet a membership roster of that particular advisory body and who was in attendance at the December 5th meeting that is referenced on the title of that document. I won't spend much time going over the status quo other than to say these are current laws or DNR board rules or policies that are currently in existence, and so status quo obviously would mean no change to these. The only thing that there might be a change in it would be under number 4. Right now, DNR board rule defines the boundaries between the sounds and the waters that are typically open for trawling. A couple of those delineations are by physical point and not a latitude and longitude. So this is just sort of a refinement that might get done in the future, but that would be through the board rulemaking process if we went forward with that. I want to call your attention to the list under changes. The first one is to allow modified cast nets with a minimum mesh size of 5/8 inch bar for commercial and recreational harvest of food shrimp with no restriction on the length of the net. This would require a law change, and this was one of the most highly divisive topics that the stakeholder panel worked through, and it's also the public input on this is highly divided, as you can see by the results of the public meetings and the web survey. The concerns about this gear range from the fact that it is too efficient and it will allow people to easily catch more than their limit, which would encourage them to violate the possession limits, to possibly sell recreational caught shrimp, which would be in violation of law, a variety of things like that, to on the pro side saying if you've got a possession limit, then why make me throw 100 times to get it when I can throw 20 times to get it. And I did bring a modified cast net with me today just in case some of you have never seen one. If you'd like to see one, I have one here with me today.
I believe it'd be a good idea if right now you would take a minute and show the committee members, because I don't know that, I'm not sure that all of them realize what we're talking about.
You can imagine that when this went through the metal detector, they were kind of curious about what this was. But a modified cast net is a conventional cast net that has been modified by the addition of some material above the lead line. In this case, it's bubble wrap, just like you would see items shipped in. It can also be done with duct tape, lawn chair webbing, a variety of other materials. What this does is the natural performance of a cast net is to throw it out flat and wide like a frisbee, and then it collapses on itself as it sinks in the water. This material acts like a hydrofoil, and it keeps that net flatter in the water as it sinks, so that this net is more effective in deeper water with this modification than it would be without it. So that's one version of it, and this is a net that was confiscated by our law enforcement.
What size net is that?
Well, I hadn't unwrapped. I'm guessing this is probably a 12. It looks like a 12-footer to me. And Tim or Jimmy, would you unwrap that and we can show them what a 12-foot long net looks like?
And let me ask you, when you do when you got it modified like that, does it help you throw a better circle, or it's nothing to do with that?
No, it really doesn't help the throwing. It just helps the performance of the net once it's actually in the water. And one thing about it is because of the natural tendency of the net to flatten out in the water, a less accomplished net thrower it's a little more forgiving for a net thrower. But that was a very contentious issue, as it has been for several years now.
What size, excuse me for interrupting.
That's okay.
What size mesh is on that particular net there? Do you
What would you guess?
know?
5/8.
It looks like it's probably 5/8. And most people who are seriously engaged in food shrimp harvest self-regulate themselves with a 1/2 inch or a 5/8 anyway, because it's going to allow smaller shrimp, which are less desirable for food, to escape through the mesh anyway, or more likely to escape through the
Let's
mesh.
talk about that while we're on that issue, just for a second, because I noticed that you recommend, or the shrimp advisory panel recommended a 5/8 inch net. And, I've been told that there's a lot of, recreational shrimpers right now that would have to buy new nets because they in fact have a 1/2 inch size net right now.
Right, that would certainly be an outcome of this, that right now the recreational size limit is 1/2 inch, commercial's 5/8. And so if this were to become law, then obviously the 1/2 inch nets would now be illegal. So that's the department's position on 1/2 inch versus 5/8 inches, we're neutral on that. I mean, in terms of the difference it makes in shrimp escapement, it's more of a practical decision than it is a biological decision.
You want to, what size net?
I think we determined this is 12 foot. Yeah, that's a 12 footer. So, see, there's a lot of webbing.
Yeah, that's,
20 pounds, weighs 20 pounds.
weighs how much?
20 pounds.
20 pounds? Take a good
Okay.
man to throw that all day.
It would. The recommendation on no restriction of the length of the net, that was argued back and forth, and obviously there's a lot of conflicting opinions about that. When the department was asked to provide any input on that topic, the code now specifies what a cast net is in terms of its definition, and it has to be a hand-thrown net. So there are obviously some fears that someone might come up with a pneumatic cannon or some kind of thing like that that would allow folks to use a larger net that might be a cast net. But the code is very specific about it having to be thrown by hand. So that's an issue that, to put the citizens and the law enforcement guys in the position of having to measure a length of a net, but if that's something that the public feels is important, then obviously that's something that they feel strongly about. And, we're sort of neutral on that as well, on the size part of it. But we have had situations arise in the past where an individual would buy a custom-made net that somebody hand-built for them, and then they would buy a machine-made net out of a factory from Asia. And, when you stretch the net out and put a measuring tape to it, there would be a deviation in the length of the net. And obviously our law enforcement officers are not interested in writing citations for an extra 3 or 4 inches of webbing, but it does put them in a kind of a interesting predicament when it comes to enforcing the law. This is a very divided issue. You'll hear from the guests we asked to be here today on this, I'm sure. Number 2 directly relates back to the modified cast net. In fact, number 1, 2, and 3 are the ones that were most contentious and most strongly divided the stakeholder panel and the public. Number 2 would be to close state waters to the recreational harvest of food shrimp on November 30. This is in recognition of the fact that we don't know how many people are engaged in recreational cast netting. We have no specific license, permit, stamp, or anything that allows us to know how many people are doing it. And there is a concern that if the modified cast net is allowed, again, that there will be a renewed interest in cast netting, particularly in the recreational sector, and we could be seeing a drastic increase in recreational cast netting effort. And there is concerns about the vulnerability of overwintering shrimp, and these are the shrimp that settle into the deeper waters to reside there during the winter and ultimately become, or some percentage of them become, the spawners for the next spring and start the life cycle all over again. So the November 30 termination is just a recognition of the uncertainty, that we don't know how many people would be doing this recreationally. That is a time period, very few people go after November 30 recreationally anyway, if they're true recreational. So that just sort of puts some parameters on it. And you can see that the DNR Commissioner currently has the authority to set a different season for different sectors of the fishery. So that could be done through the Commissioner's authority. It wouldn't require a law change. There was one member.
Go on, because I know if you like that one concerns recreational, the next one concerns commercial cast netters. I think everybody probably understands, but in case they don't, will you briefly describe all the stakeholders in this process?
Oh, sure. Yes, sir. Well, what we've got when it comes to shrimp, you've got everybody from the people who catch them to the people that eat them and sort of everything in between. But you've got the major sectors could be classified as the food shrimp trawlers. These are the typical shrimp boats that have become such an icon along the southeast United States coast. You've got the individuals who wholesale shrimp that are typically trawl-caught shrimp. You have the commercial cast netters, which is something that's sort of unique to Georgia in that we have a commercial cast net fishery in Georgia by virtue of the law changes that went into effect in the late 1990s. However, this is not an open access fishery. It is limited by law to no more than 200 individuals, as our crab fishery is also a limited or controlled access fishery. Right now we have about 82 licenses in the commercial cast net fishery issued this current year. The trawl fishery is an unlimited number of licenses. In other words, we can sell as many power-drawn trawl licenses as there are applicants for those licenses. Right now we have 324 of those. Then you have the recreational cast netters. These are people who are throwing cast nets that either catch food shrimp or catch bait shrimp, and sometimes both. And those are the major harvesters, and then you've got the people that buy shrimp. You've got the guys who go out and catch live bait shrimp to be sold at a marina, because a lot of people don't want to throw a cast net. Their time is limited in the boat, so they'd rather buy a quarter shrimp and go fishing and use their time fishing instead of trying to find bait. That's a particularly lucrative endeavor there. We have 23 people that have live bait licenses in Georgia, very tightly regulated component of the shrimp fishery. And then you've got fishing guides and recreational guys who just buy shrimp. And then you've got the general public that buys shrimp and the restaurants who buy shrimp. So it covers the whole gamut.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Back to number two, one of the individuals on our panel suggested moving the closing date for the recreational harvest back to October 31st again, because they've got a particular concern about the vulnerability of these overwintering shrimp and the fact that, every year is different. The onset of winter comes differently, and this year, it looks like we had a winter in December and then it went away, and now we've got 75-degree temperatures down there, and so it's highly variable from one year to the next. Number three deals with the possession limits for commercial cast netters. Right now, commercial cast netters are restricted to 60 quarts head zone of shrimp per day. Just to contrast that, the recreational harvesters are restricted to 48 quarts of head zone per day per person or per boat. So if they've got 3 people in a boat, they're still restricted to 48 quart cooler, or if they're operating as an individual in a boat by themselves, they can still have 48 quarts. Again, this was one where there's a lot of divided opinions from the different sectors. The commercial cast netters feel like if they're going to be a legitimate enterprise, and they need to be able to operate in a manner that provides the greatest opportunity for profit. So obviously they would like to see more liberal possession limits. The trawler, food shrimp trawler fishery is not bound by possession limits by comparison. But then the commercial live bait fishermen do have limits. So if a trawler goes out and he's catching live bait shrimp, he's restricted in the number he can have. So it runs the gamut depending on the sector of the fishery. What you see here is the best that could be produced. There's not consensus on this, but it would be to allow 150 quarts through November 30, and then after December 1st, that possession limit would be decreased. And then there would ultimately have to be a decision made on part of the department to look at the conditions that exist and to decide whether it would be prudent to continue to allow a cast net harvest in the estuary or not, after the 1st of December. The remainder of this list, there was generally pretty strong agreement. From 4 down through 13, there were some differences of opinion, but there was not nearly the divided opinions like you see on 1, 2, and 3. Number 4 is getting back to something that the General Assembly did a few years ago. This was done at the request of the shrimp trawler industry. They were concerned about larger boats coming into state waters, and so a maximum trawl size law was passed, and then we ran into problems with the enforceability of that, and there was a 7-foot draft exclusion put into that, and the discussions led to the point that, given all the things that are changing and going on, and for simplification's purposes, then just repealing this would be a prudent course of action. And again, there wasn't 100% agreement on this, but there was a lot of agreement on it. Number 5 is something that that could be done that would help all sectors of the commercial food shrimp harvest fishery. Right now, if an individual is displaced from their traditional dock, say for instance they've been in a commercial dock for 30 years, that dock is sold to be turned into a private marina or something like that, that individual has to find another commercial dock because they cannot go to a marina that sells live bait shrimp and unload their food shrimp at that facility. What number 5 does is addresses that. It would allow the offloading of food shrimp at a place that's licensed to sell bait shrimp and wholesale of those shrimp, but not retail. And this would give food shrimp harvesters some greater flexibility to conduct business in a rapidly changing world. Number 6, as I mentioned, we have a fishery for live bait shrimp. We have designated areas of the estuary where people can go in and pull a bait shrimp trawl. These are what we call bait zones. Right now, a commercial live bait harvester cannot use a cast net. They are forced to use a trawl. But what is happening as the coast develops, we're starting to see encroachment into some of these bait zones. Private docks are being built, and a person who just spent $70,000 building a dock, sometimes they are resentful of a guy dragging a trawl through that creek. And yes, they're the last ones to get there, but it breeds conflict. And what we've heard from some of the bait shrimp harvesters is if they had the flexibility to use a cast net, it might reduce conflict with some of these waterfront property owners and dock owners. So, that's what number 6 is addressing, and all the other restrictions that affect bait shrimp harvest would remain the same. Number 7 is an action that would make consistent all of the commercial fishing hours. Right now, trawlers can operate from 5 in the morning to 8 p.m. A live bait harvester goes from 30 minutes before sunrise to 30 minutes after sunset, and commercial cast netters can go 24 hours a day. So we have it's all over the board. And there was pretty strong support for this amongst all the different sectors so that it would be uniform across all commercial fishing. Number 8 was a recommendation made after all the discussions about us not knowing how many people are engaged in recreational shrimp harvesting. And we are already looking at some options for this that might involve a no-cost permit or some other type of mechanism where we could collect the data and not necessarily put a fee on the public. Number 9, again, is a simplification measure. Right now, if a recreational fisherman leaves a boat ramp and they want to go catch shrimp for fish bait, they carry one net. If they want to go catch shrimp to take home and eat, they carry another net. They can't carry both nets in the boat at the same time. And obviously with $2.20 a gallon gasoline, a person really doesn't want to ride 10 miles to their fishing drop and then turn around and come back to the boat ramp, drop off their cast net, pick up their food shrimp cast net, and go back and catch food shrimp. So we've talked over all this with law enforcement, and they don't see any big issues with that because all the other possession limits will continue in place. Number 10 is an internal policy to Coastal Resources in the department. This deals with opening and closing these bait zones that I mentioned earlier. Number 11 is a housekeeping issue to deal with one of the problems we've had, and that is we issue licenses in these controlled access fisheries by lotteries. If somebody does not renew their license, then it goes into a lottery. What we're finding ourselves doing is having a lot of public demand for licenses that aren't issued through the lottery, and we have no mechanism to disperse these on a first-come, first-served basis. And obviously, if 200 licenses is a suitable number, it'd be nice to be able to issue all 200 of those licenses through the course of the year. That deals with that. Number 12 is addressing interest as much out of the trawler fleet itself as any group about dealing with a reduction in the overall number of trawlers in Georgia waters. We are seeing a situation where that's going down every year anyway, just because of the economic effects that are going on and the loss of fishing infrastructure. So This is something that we fully intend to investigate and study our options. And number 13 addresses an ongoing frustration that the department has with getting consistent adjudication of shrimp fishing violations in the criminal court system. It is obviously going to be up to a judge in a criminal court system as to whether they dismiss a case or whether they prosecute a case. There's strong feeling amongst a lot of people in the shrimp fishery that if we had greater capacity to move civilly in some of these cases and do license revocations and fishing privilege suspensions, that sort of thing, that might be a stronger deterrent than having to depend solely on the criminal court system. So that's real quick the recommendations that emerged, and what I'd like to do, unless you have some questions, Mr. Chairman and committee members.
Well, we'll stop right there and allow for some questions if anybody has any. I don't see any.
Well, if not, what I'd like to do is call up in alphabetical order our guests and let them share with you their perspectives and opinions about the process and the recommendations themselves. And I'm going to start with Mr. Jimmy Drury.
Well, we appreciate these gentlemen coming while he's coming to the mic to tell all of you. We appreciate the effort you made to come and be with the committee and help us in the process and make us aware of what's going on. I know a lot of times it's hard for us to step up in front of a microphone. It's a little intimidating sometimes, but we just regular old folks just like you are, so you feel at ease and just tell us whatever's on your mind.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm from the recreational side of it, I guess you could say. I want to first take a minute to appreciate what the DNR has tried to do. I mean, we've gone a long way with this thing. They've put forth a lot of effort, done a really good job. I mean, I've been involved in it from the first day, and I've been impressed with the way it was handled, and the facilitator and everybody done a good job. I really think everybody had ample opportunity to get their point across, whatever they had to say. As far as it goes from the recreational side of it, I was the first one to stand up and say, look, we'll back off to the November 30th thing. They're in trouble because these guys are trying to make a living, and we're just out there to get whatever we can get. But also in the recreational point, you can't penalize me if I can get 48 quarts. Why does it matter how I get them? And you're going to have a few people that's going to go out and get over the limit, but you're going to have that in anything. Why should the good people suffer for what one or two of the bad folks do? On that being on a modified cast net. If we had a modified net, you're going to go out, and the recreational guy's not going to get 10 or 15, 20 pounds anyway. They're going to throw that net 10 or 15 times. They're going to be tired, and they're going to go on fishing or whatever it is I do for the rest of the day. In short, that's pretty much the way I look at it, from a recreational standpoint. I know it's a lot more important to some of these other people, but I wanted to be here to give my main goal is to make sure that the way the process was handled off in the recreation, I thought they'd done an excellent job.
Good. Well, we appreciate you coming and want the committee to know that you are representing again the recreational side, and they're going to hear from each different stakeholders. If y'all have any questions from his perspective, then now's the time to ask him. Do you have any questions? Hearing any of that, so we appreciate again you making the effort to come and be with us, and appreciate the comments you had.
Thank you, Jimmy. Next, I'd like to invite up Tim Jones from Camden County.
Thank y'all for hearing me today. I want to thank the DNR and the Institute here for going through all the meetings with us that we went over. But something that I want this board up here to realize is that commercially, I'm a cast netter, and there's two different industries. You have a trawler industry and a cast netting industry. Back on this page that we were on for the recommendations where we had the 1, 2, 3, if you turn to number 3, where it says we increased the daily possession limit for commercial cast net food shrimp harvest to 150 quarts through November 30th. On December the 1st, the possession limit is reduced to 75 quarts. The reason for that being is because there was a lot of concerns on the overwintering shrimp. Well, the lifespan of a shrimp is usually 12 months. In 1994 and 1995, we had a hard freeze that devastated our shrimping industry then. The next following year, the shrimp trawlers broke a record for the most shrimp that was ever caught. So I think Mother Nature can do a little bit more damage than 83 commercial cast netters can. And I just hope that we could come to a conclusion where my kid one day could take my footsteps and have the right to choose to be a commercial cast netter. And on another issue, without the modified nets, the industry is down where it is right now, which is at 82, 83. With the use of the modified cast nets, your license would fill out. And with the environmental issues that we have going on with turtles, bycatch issues, to me this is a more environmental friendly industry. Development impacts, economic impacts. It's just another alternative that we all really need to look at on all sides of the issue as far as it being environmental friendly. And as far as the season goes for commercial cast netter, with the scientific data that DNR uses right now, the process that they use was a 40-count shrimp closure, has been working accurate to keep people off of the small shrimp. And like I say, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And if there's any questions right now from anyone.
Anybody on the committee got a question? Let me ask one question. Is you as a commercial cast netter, is this a limit that y'all asked for? Is this something that the committee, is it a compromise situation? I mean, did the commercial
Right. Well, see,
200 quarts?
I see what you're saying. Well, at first, when we had talked about this, it was unlimited. Okay? And through some talks and everything, we had come up with a conclusion of 150 quarts. Well, the overwintering shrimp issue had come up because from the guys I know that do this for a living commercially, and it's like what Spud was talking about earlier, weather, salinity, temperature change, it was 78 degrees yesterday, dictates the migration species of these shrimp where they're going. And to literally close it for us on a December the 1st would basically devastate our industry. Also, we usually, depending on where you're at on the coastline, don't start catching shrimp until about the last week of August. So for me to pay $255 for a commercial license to shrimp for 60 days when there may not anything be there, it's a hit and miss situation. But we listen, we work, we try to negotiate with the other parties in the industry, and I hope as a body everybody will look at this and take my livelihood in consideration as a commercial cast netter. We're the only commercial industry that has a limit. And it's like I said before, if you measure bycatch ratios, most everything that we catch, it lives. Very little that we do catch dies. We're not in the areas where the turtles are. And like I say, we try to work with the DNR and any organization that we can to help promote this industry in a whole, throughout the state of Georgia.
Let me ask, we've got a question down front here.
Mm-hmm.
You're a commercial cast netter.
Yes, sir.
Do you, we know that the modified net's not enforced all the way across the board.
Correct.
Do you have to leave home to go fish or a cast net, or how do you?
Yeah. Oh, well, with the modified cast net, it's sort of like what Spud says. The efficiency of the net, as far as helping you catch your catch, without it, you're basically out of business.
I just wonder, are you going to McIntosh County, for instance?
Well, no, I'm in Camden.
I know you live there, but
would I go to Camden?
Do you go to McIntosh? Because
on occasion I do.
In Camden, it's enforced, isn't it?
No.
It's not enforced now?
No, not right now it's not.
Okay.
Camden and McIntosh are the two counties that it's not enforced at. And literally, that's why you have a license of 82 or 83 right now. Because that's the same principle as you got 4 wheels on a car, but let's go to Atlanta and take 1 wheel off. That's basically what it does to my industry.
Are you saying that that people are using modified net and it's not being enforced in those 2 counties? Is that what you said?
That's correct.
Okay. The question I had was a pretty hard question, but I want to hear what your response is to it.
Mm-hmm.
Can 83 cast netters with 12-foot modified nets
Mm-hmm.
do damage to the shrimp population for the next year?
In my opinion, no. That's coming straight from my heart. There's no way possible that I could see. Not 83 of them. Not when you have hard freezes.
Back up, 200 of them, because there's 200 possible licenses.
200 of them, I would say no. Now, I'm speaking commercially. Recreationally,
Well,
there's
I
no
don't
statistic
think-
on how many recreational cast netters there are.
Yeah.
That's like saying there are 20,000 recreational. We don't have the answer on how many recreationals are, but speaking for commercial, we could only have 200. 200 commercial cast netters would not make a dent in the shrimping population when you're comparing it not only to other industries in a whole, too.
Can y'all, you really do good when it gets cold in the deep holes. Can y'all pretty much fish out those deep holes?
No. They're migratory. See, that's another misconception, too, is everybody says that we shrimp and target the deep holes. Well, the shrimp are really not in the holes. They're on a ledge that leads to the hole. And the reason why I say that, because I've got high-end depth recorders, and the reason I've always thought the reason why they do that, it gives that shrimp a choice. If something's chasing him, he could go deep or he can go shallow. But they're not really nesting in the hole down there. That's always been a misconception that I've been hearing this for 2 years, and it's really not true.
Any other questions from the committee? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you, Tim. Next, I'd like to ask Pat Matthews from Chatham County, if he would come up and address the committee.
Well, thank you to Spud and Susan and the rest of the DNR staff and the committee for having me here today. I run a shrimp dock down in Savannah and Tybee Island. It's been in my family for 3 generations now, since about the early 1900s. And the main concern I have is with protecting the shrimp industry in the state of Georgia. And I feel like that my biggest fear is by allowing these modified cast nets, that we're enabling them the opportunity to catch our winter overcrop, which is, everybody knows is the main conservation that we have. That shrimp is a mass reproducer, and that's the shrimp we're trying to protect. And I just feel like I've been to all these stakeholder meetings and this summer, and the public hearings and everything also, and I feel like the reason there was not a consensus on the modified cast nets is because it's not in the best interest of the whole industry. And I hate to throw all that out the door and just say we can't have taped up cast nets. And I see that there's a compromise here that probably we can all live with without, the cast netters can make a living without depleting the resource, the winter overcrop, and that we rely on to renew our resource each year. And I'm thinking that I wrote a little note here. I'll just read it to you. I feel there was no consensus for the controversial modified cast net fishery in the Sounds because of the time frame the cast netters wanted was not in the best interest of the shrimp resource and everyone concerned. The DNR closed the Sounds because we were depleting the resource by not giving those shrimp the opportunity to remain inside in the deep holes and renew our resource in the spring. If we decide to allow these protected shrimp to be harvested, again, it should be done after the shrimp reach maturity The majority of our white shrimp spawn in April and May and reach maturity by mid-August and September, and should be closed when them shrimp bunch up in the deep holes to winter over. This winter over period begins in November when the water temperature drops below 60 degrees in the sounds. Now that 60-degree number may or may not be accurate. I got that from the DNR in South Carolina, and I think it's pretty close. In the shrimp industry, we have a lot of magic numbers. We always say the shrimp start spawning in, when the water temperature gets 70 degrees, and usually by the time it's 80 degrees, the brown shrimp are ready to come out, and we work on them in the summertime. And I think it should be, I'd like to see the Department of Natural Resources give us a biological time every year that would be in the best interest of the industry. Hopefully, they can just make that decision each year and allow these people to fish in the sounds with these taped up nets until the shrimp begin to winter over and bunch up. And I think that probably if they start looking at it around the 1st of November and make a decision at that time or sometime, or be able to get the commissioner to close the inside fishery at a different time from our offshore fishery, which is, the beach is what we call the offshore fishery. And I hate to see them allowed to catch the shrimp that we're trying to protect, that we rely on to renew this resource each year. Has anybody got anything else I could say that you don't understand? I think everybody understands that, but I just wanted to.
Let me ask one question.
Okay.
Do you, are you saying you don't agree with the recommendation saying father modified? You don't think we ought to have him modified nets?
No, sir, because I feel like it's just like right now that, if I catch a trawler dragging in the sounds, he drags through one of them holes, that it's a big, that we would like to see that enforced as strictly as we can and have a heck of a deterrent and all to stop that from happening, because we're trying to protect these winter over shrimp. The reason they stay inside and get in these deep holes is to renew our resource each year. And we've got to protect those shrimp and not look at ways to catch those shrimp. And to me, the modified cast net is just a means of catching the shrimp that we're trying to protect. If it wasn't for, the only reason for the modified net is to go down in the deep, to be able to fish in the deep. And the only time the shrimp are in the deep is when they bunching up, ready to winter over. They lay there dormant and hopefully stay there until the next spring when they spawn. So, no, sir, I don't think it's a good idea. I think that if they want to be able to use the modified net to fish in the deep before the shrimp or get bunched up, before they all fall out, the ones that don't come out are the ones we need to protect. And that's the ones that are in them deep holes in the wintertime. So I think it's a timely thing. If we can close the season earlier for the inshore fishery, this cast net, taped up, modified cast net, then without, allowing them to catch those winter over shrimp, that's the main concern I have. And it can be done, with depth finder, you can anchor up right on one of them holes and sit there and throw in that hole until there's nothing left and then go to the next hole. And really, it's just as effective at wiping out the shrimp in that, in the wintertime than it is to drag a trawler through there.
Representative Burns, that's good.
Quick question, Pat.
Okay.
Or two parts to it, I guess. I see where you are a dock owner and dealer. Do you also have use a boat, or do you?
No, sir. I'm just here to represent the boats at my dock. If they wipe out the shrimp industry and there's nothing left, and I could turn it into a marina tomorrow, so it's not going to be the end of my livelihood. But I hate to see the future of all these, this industry just go to nothing. I enjoy what I do, and I've done it all my life, and it's kind of in your blood, like farming, And I just, I want to see, I hate to see them do something just because they're being pushed into it. And there was never a consensus, or there was never an agreement from everybody that what you're talking about is a handful of shrimp. It's not a lot of shrimp, but only that little bit of shrimp are the ones we rely on each year to renew the resource. It only takes a small amount, because shrimp are such a mass reproducer. And I just hate, it don't make sense. I don't see any biological rationale behind catching those shrimp.
I have a follow-up on that. Just change it a little bit. Now, did you say you could possibly agree with the modified nets if the season was closed earlier?
Yes, sir.
Is that what you said?
I sure could. I think that'd be the way to go.
How much earlier?
Well, I think it should be left up to the biologists with the Department of Natural Resources, Pat Gear, whoever that make that decision. But I think it should be looked at before November, sometime in 1st of November to December, because it just depends on the water temperature. Each year could be different, I think. But I know it could occur as early as November. I'm not saying it should be closed on the 1st of November. They may be able to go longer than that. Yes, sir.
Going back to the two counties, shrimp migrating, do they usually switch from one county to another large land area? I mean, I know those right on the border, but I was just wondering if they moved around quite a bit.
Well, all the Spud, Susan can tell you this, or anybody with the DNR Coastal Division, but all the tests that they've done, tagging shrimp and all that, they've always, when they come outside of the sounds, on the beaches, they've all been caught to the southern. They go all the way down to the Cape, I think, and they've never found any further south than the Cape, but they always move south, and they never come back, So, but now. Okay, go ahead.
The reason I was asking that question, can we see any effect if we're doing the modified net now? Can we see any effect in those areas now as far as depletion of the shrimp? That's basically, some of y'all may have to answer that.
Well, there's really no way to tell because, it's all up to the conditions. But now, if you ever have the right conditions in the summertime for them shrimp that are spawned to survive and make a good crop of shrimp, it's a no-win situation if you've already caught the roe shrimp up that are going to do that spawning in the springtime. So the only real control, the only thing we can do to protect, to ensure that we have to maximize our crop, basically, is to protect those shrimp and give them every chance they can to spawn. And then the rest is up to Mother Nature. It may take a few shrimp to make a bunch of shrimp, and it may take a lot depending on the conditions. But either way, if you don't catch those shrimp and you let them spawn, then you're better off. Whether if you get the good conditions, you'll have more. If you don't, then you're still better off.
Any other questions from the committee? Let me ask you one, and I'm asking something I'm not sure the answer is to start. I mean, I don't know. I'm asking a question, but I know that South Carolina allows you to bait, and I know that they have, I guess they have commercial cast netting, don't they? They don't have commercial, just recreational.
Not commercial, but they do have a modified cast net, and they're looking at stopping that. They just started it, I think, I don't even know when, in the last year or two. And they're realizing that it really is damaging their winter over crop. That they couldn't believe how many shrimp they could actually harvest. And they closed the season. I think it was the first week in December. But they're thinking about. I know I talked to a guy that works with the DNR in South Carolina, and he said they were thinking about moving that date up.
Are the trawlers having less of success as a result of that? Are you trawler boats? Are they exactly?
Again, there's really no way to tell because they caught the shrimp that, how do you know whether you wouldn't have had more shrimp or not?
Well, based on the previous years, are they having a drop? Are the harvest dropping in South Carolina from the trawler?
I'm sure they are. If they're catching the shrimp that are that would have spawned. You know, they're going to have less shrimp. I think that, I couldn't answer that notion.
A question from David Knight.
It's a good question, and I think the gentleman's made a point. He wants to go on based on, sound biology. There should be records from South Carolina that should be able to back up this. I mean, I would think that their Department of Natural Resources, the DNR, would be able to supply some.
They may could. I know it's recreational, so I don't know whether they have any reporting of what's caught or not, or what, how they actually do that, but.
I mean, that's what we're looking for ultimately, is to make a good scientific, isn't it? I mean, that's what I'm hearing you also say. Do it based on sound biology.
And sound biology tells you got to protect those shrimp and allow them to winter over, and spawn. That's the whole reason we have shrimp in this state, and then we have a resource like we do is because they're such a mass reproducer, and we have to allow them that opportunity to spawn, to winter over and spawn. And the inside, by closing the sounds, we've done that. We've proven it over the last 30 years or so since the sounds have been closed. We've not depleted the resource, where before that we were depleting the resource. There used to be my daddy can tell you, 40 years ago, they called there was shrimp everywhere. They couldn't catch them. There was so many shrimp, we didn't have to worry about it. And by fishing them sounds, it was steady declining. When we closed the sounds off and protected them and gave them every chance to spawn, the resource is holding its own. And maybe, you got good and bad years, but it's not declining like it was. So I think if we keep, it's just like everybody, the general consensus was at all these stakeholder meetings that our Department of Natural Resources is doing a great job in managing our resource, and that we need to leave it alone like it is. And then now we're talking about making a change that could, be detrimental to the industry. And that's what I'm concerned with, that we don't allow them to catch the winter over shrimp. And the only way I see to do that, if you're going to have modified taped up nets, is to close the season earlier on them before the shrimp get in that position to winter over.
Good. Thank you very much.
I appreciate y'all. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. And now I'd like to call John Wallace from McIntosh County.
Thanks, Bud. Thank you, committee, for listening to us today. I am the president of Georgia Shrimp Association. I've been through a lot of these changes throughout my term and throughout while I've been a member of the association. And I had handed out to y'all a paper that the association had given. And I can let y'all read through it, but I mean, we do have some opinions on this, and a lot of them have been stated with the modified nets and as far as the recreational use. We don't want to stop anyone from catching what they or their family can eat. But we do have a problem with the laws that are in effect in Georgia concerning the recreational sale of shrimp. They do a better job with their saltwater products license in Florida. If we could implement something there that would close up the loopholes in these recreational laws, there's not a real concern over the modified nets from the recreational side. These loopholes do allow the recreational to go out and catch their limit or above their limit, and it's almost impossible to convict them in court for selling these, whether it's to a wholesaler or to a private individual. So those are the reasons that we cannot endorse the recreational use of a modified cast net in the Georgia estuaries until we get some comfortable assurance that these laws can be enforced and convicted in the court of law. As far as the commercial use of modified nets, we as trawlers were allowed to fish in the sounds until the early 80s. And we voluntarily left for the conservation of those sounds. And as Tim said earlier, he was stating that it was going to put them out of business in order to to not allow that modification. Well, not allowing us in those sounds, or allowing trawlers in those sounds, in the early 80s, we had over 1,200 trawler licenses in this state. Now we're down to 320, I think Spud said. So, yeah, basically the discretion of the DNR, because the sounds were not closed, we're not opened. We lost 800 jobs, 800 trawlers, but the remainder of us adapted. So, that's what we were, modified nets, commercial casting in there may have to adapt. But allowing another commercial entity into those sounds while you're restricting the trawlers from going in, and even if it's going to be a limited access as far as the 150 quarts. If we give a proposal in there that would allow us to pull a small net and catch 150 quarts and give equal access. And pretty much what's fair for them should be fair for us. And that's our pretty much our stance on the commercial use of modified nets. We can endorse fixing the law to where it is convictable, the existing law of if you get caught over the limit or the use of the modified nets, make it convictable in court. The putting a law out there that a judge can overturn needs to be corrected to where this law can be better convictability anyway. You may not be able to get 100%, but you should make these cases stand up in court. Right now, pretty much the enforcement has become nil in those two counties particularly. There's rampant use of modified nets, and there's very little enforcement going on because pretty much the judges have refused to listen to the case. So we do endorse fixing the current law and making all the laws that we do enforceable. Like I say, the letter has a little more explanation on what can do and our points on it, and if y'all like to read it and ask questions, I'd be glad to answer them, or I can answer any questions now.
Anyone have any questions? Mr. Wallace. I don't guess so. John, we appreciate you coming and being with us, and appreciate each and every one of you and the way you perceive any changes in the law and what we'll do to affect your particular side of this industry. Spud, I'll let you finish up with some closing remarks that you want to. You've heard all the comments. If there's anything that you'd like to make comment on, or.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank y'all for your time, and I want to express my personal thanks to these gentlemen for their yeoman service to the citizens of the state of Georgia. I mean, time is the most precious thing we have, and they gave their time to this process, and we very much appreciate it. I think you've heard that there's a lot of differing opinions on these matters. The list of recommendations that you have before you, the department is of the opinion that there's nothing in there that's contrary to the wise use and conservation of our resources. However, if there are any changes to those recommendations, obviously we'd like to reevaluate those. And we feel like that there's some potential here to alleviate some of the conflicts that have been persistent for the last several years. We appreciate y'all being willing to take this information and deliberate over it, and we stand ready to provide you any advice or any technical information that you need.
Is there anybody on the committee that doesn't have a clear understanding of the issues we talked about, or wants to ask Spud for clarification, or you got anything that's on your mind? Spud, we appreciate what y'all do as a department. Appreciate the cooperation you've gotten from the people that you regulate or that you try to provide good laws for. Appreciate all of you in attendance. That was pretty much the scope of the meeting today, and if there's no further question, anybody in the audience have any comments?
Sure. I'm David Wallace. Up until about 3 years ago, I represented the commercial.
Hey, David, would you come up to because this is being transmitted, and I want to give the audience that we might not can see a benefit of what you can say.
I'm sorry I didn't sign up to speak. I didn't realize there was a requirement, but I apologize for that. I represented the commercial cast netters up until about 3 years ago, and we more or less disbanded our effort when we saw there was very little chance of us getting any changes, and then lo and behold, Spud, and I really appreciate him doing that, appointed this committee and study committee, and they really done a great job in at least addressing the issues and bringing them all to the forefront. I can only add that I still have a commercial cast net license, and I still participate in the industry, but not full time. But I'd like to say that I endorse most of the provisions that they've come up with in this study, and that it would really be a big help to the industry as a whole to pass some of these recommendations that they've offered, especially the modified nets and the increased limit. That was the two provisions that I asked for when I was coming to your meetings and asking for changes in that law. I just think that it would create a lot more harmony on the coast if we did make some of these changes and allow the people that make a living at it full time. And I hope that I can someday get back to at least doing it more than just part time. As Tim said, the reason we have only 82 license holders now is because you just can't make a living without a modified net and with a 60-quart limit. And these are the two biggest provisions. As far as the time to close the season, I did it long enough to where I know that 100 or 200 commercial cast netters are not going to deplete the resource, the overwintering shrimp. These shrimp that they're catching before, when it was a great issue, they were catching the shrimp in the deep holes down in Camden County in the southern part of the state, and they were catching a lot of shrimp. And they addressed that with putting the cast net season so that you could close them, along with the commercial trawlers. And, you know, we felt like that was a fair thing to do. And as far as closing them October 1st or November the 1st, you really don't have a lot of shrimp that stay in there during that period. They fall out. In other words, they had, just a few weeks ago, we had a big falling out, and the trawlers were catching, you know, a lot of shrimp, 50, 60, 100 boxes a day. And those shrimp that were coming out of those holes, they catch them, and they fall out in the sounds so that they're caught as they leave the sounds. But, you know, we just feel like if you let the cast net season parallel the trawling season, then there's no harm done. But I thank you for letting me make comments, and if you have any questions, I'd like to answer them.
Just real quickly, I mean, we saw that, but I keep hearing about holes, deep holes, and how deep is a hole, how far out?
Well, they're in the rivers and the sounds. The deep hole that I was referring to is in the intercoastal waterway, right near the submarine base.
So how deep?
It's about 55 feet.
You're actually
Right. You're throwing your net out. It takes a minute for it to sink to the bottom. Normally, though, you're shrimping in water 20 to 25 feet deep. That cast net without the tape on it will start closing up, and we've actually filmed them. After 15 feet, it starts closing up. By the time it hits 25 feet, it's probably only about 3 feet or 4 feet wide. So, you know, that's normally in October and November when the shrimp are along the banks and the sounds, we're catching them in 30 feet of water. And that cast net is very effective. You can throw one without tape and you might catch 10 shrimp. And you can throw one with tape and you might catch a pound. And it makes a lot of difference. A pound or 2 pounds or even 5 pounds. Depends on how thick they are. So, and I would like to add that I agree with what Tim said. As long as you have a limit, then, you know, why stop our ability to catch that limit? Thank you.
Dave, we appreciate you coming, appreciate your comments. What I suspect will happen is that we will probably, all of us will take what we've heard here today into account. If there's somebody on the committee, if the committee chooses to move forward with a bill, I think with the council of the Coastal Resources Division, what they picked up from these, from this study, from this, I guess it's a management study, whatever the title of this stakeholders process was, the whole deal. If they feel like there's a need to move forward, and any of these guys have the option to present something. Where to go from there, we don't know, but we got some. These folks can come up with some pretty clever ideas sometime, and I think they have at heart an interest to be fair to everybody and to protect the resources. And I think that y'all have. I think the expertise that they had with these stakeholders and the people that served on these committees, I think it gives us some guidance into what might need to be done. And if there's a need to move forward, we will. If there's not, we won't. That's pretty much how I'm gonna leave it with you. I really don't know what the pleasure of the committee is, or any of these individuals, or anybody else that serves. But we do appreciate all that you've done. I realize the time commitment that each of you had in coming up with these recommendations, and as hard as it is to get two people from two different viewpoints, I guess all of you have a different perspective of the issue, and I think all of you want to conserve and protect our shrimp fishery. So, I think all that your input and all has given us at least some ideas. I think there's some things that we still need to consider. I always hate to compare us to other states and do what other states do or don't do, but sometimes you can benefit from other people's mistakes, and so we want to look at that issue also. But anyhow, if none of the other members anybody have any comments before we close? If not, then I'll adjourn the meeting. Thank y'all.